Hello, welcome to the Address of Fear. If you love horror stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. If you're ready, let's get started. Eliza had been living in the old large house for a week, located on the outskirts of town, by the edge of the forest. This house felt like a sanctuary when she decided to live alone. The place was spacious, with old scratches on the walls and stains that told the story of time. The house gave Eliza a strange sense of peace. She wanted to escape the echoes of the past. It was a search for peace, for calm. Everything had started within these walls, wrapped in a silence. However, that night, peace would give way to unease. The house seemed to carry the marks of several decades. The wooden floors creaked with every step, and the sound of the wind in the attic echoed through the corners of the rooms. Eliza had begun to get used to spending the night there. Everything seemed to be as it should. But on the first night, she noticed something. There was something unexpected about the house. She just hadn't realized it yet. It was around 12:30 a.m. Eliza tossed and turned in her bed for a while. She was trying to escape the fatigue of the day while listening to the silence in the room. This silence felt different from usual. As usual, there were creaking sounds from the walls. But tonight, she noticed that these sounds were echoing more deeply, more meaningfully. Her eyes were getting heavy. Struggling against insomnia, suddenly, her gaze fixed on the door that led to the living room. For a moment, she thought it was just a dream, but something had started to change at that very instant. The door directly in front of her was slowly moving. At first, she thought it was just the wind. However, the room's windows were shut, and it seemed almost impossible for the wind to be blowing. The air was cold, and she wanted to believe that this was the only thing disturbing the night's silence. But the door, after pausing for a moment, continued. Slowly and steadily it began to creak open. At that moment, a strange feeling began to gnaw at Eliza. She realized that something wasn't right. She barely cracked her eyes open and focused on the door. As the door opened, there was a sound coming from the living room that seemed to suggest something was watching her. The further the door opened, the deeper everything seemed to become, as if a subconscious fear had wrapped around her entire body. She slowly leaned back, feeling the tension in her body. Thousands of questions raced through her mind, but one thing was certain. The door opening was much more than the effect of the wind. Eliza closed her eyes again and briefly considered waiting for whatever it was to come inside. This wasn't normal, but the door opened wide. Okay, someone must be playing a prank, she thought. Somehow someone had entered her house, or maybe it was just a result of the house's old structure. But no matter what, deep down, she had a feeling that something was watching her in the silence of this house. She opened her eyes again. There was no one in front of the door. With a sense of unease, she tensed her body and slowly got out of bed. She moved quietly toward the living room. In the deep darkness of the house, all the sounds between the walls seemed to merge. She could hear the echoes of those moments reverberating through the old rooms. When she reached the living room, there was only one thing. The door was wide open in front of her. She took another step, but the door continued to open on its own. Eliza briefly thought about waiting for the morning, but she couldn't stay awake until then. As she looked into the emptiness of the door, she couldn't see anything. So many things were uncertain. But one thing she knew for sure was that the door opening made the night feel somehow different. That night, Eliza couldn't find anything between dream and reality. But there was a suspicion inside her that something was approaching her in the silence of the house, like an echo of the past. Eliza had managed to get through the night staying awake with fear, feeling every sound and every movement drawing closer. But when morning came, even though the dark traces lingered in her mind, the sunlight helped ease some of the fear. She thought maybe everything was just due to exhaustion, that her mind had been working too hard from lack of sleep. Throughout the day, everything felt normal. The old house seemed a little calmer in the morning sun. She wanted to feel more of that peace. She slowly prepared her meals, did her daily tasks, and perhaps convinced herself that it was just a quirk, a malfunction, due to the old house's structure. But as evening approached, that strange feeling began to stir again within Eliza. The day had been normal, but when thinking of the night, everything changed once more. As the sun set, a gloomy atmosphere began to fill the house. Eliza tried to forget what had happened the previous night, but it wasn't that easy. On the way home, the house waited to destroy the peace inside. On her way home, the old and darkened exterior of the house seemed to be waiting to destroy the peace inside. Perhaps the night outside made the inside even darker. After midnight, Eliza was struggling with insomnia, her eyes growing heavy, and she just wanted to fall asleep and escape from these dark thoughts. However, at the same time, the fear of the previous night had once again crept into her mind. She was imagining the old sounds, the strange echoes coming from the depths of the house. Still, she closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and chose to sleep. But tonight, she didn't know that everything would be different. It was after midnight. Eliza was tossing and turning in her bed, sleepless. For a moment, fear and unease filled her. The creaking sound from the bedroom wall began to be heard again. The old walls of the house silently filled the night with a ghostly atmosphere. This time the sounds were more distinct. The creaks of the wooden floors echoed as if someone were walking inside the house. This strange sound made Eliza's skin crawl. She opened her eyes. Everything seemed more terrifying in the darkness. She had imagined getting through that night by sleeping, but suddenly sleep had vanished. After all, that night was about to begin. After a moment of silence, she heard the door to the living room begin to creak. Just like before, it started to open slowly. Eliza froze, holding her breath as she directed her gaze to the living room. The door was opening unusually in the dark of the night. Immediately, she reminded herself of the morning, convincing herself that it was just a coincidence. But forgetting the previous night wasn't that easy. Eliza slowly got out of bed and, barefoot in the dark, left her room and headed toward the living room. Her steps were lost in the deep silence of the house. At that moment, her heart began to race. The door was still open. Slowly, as she took those fear-filled steps, a question crossed her mind. Why does the door open like this every night? The sound was increasing her unease even more. As she moved forward to close the door, she heard something. A faint, trembling whisper. At first, she couldn't make sense of it, but in that moment, the words of the whisper became clearer. The words she heard were different from anything before. Don't go. Eliza's whole body froze. Her heart started racing. Suddenly, she scanned the dark corners of the room, trying to find the source of the sound. But she couldn't see anyone. The whisper was so close, but there was nothing there. No one. Taking a deep breath, she stepped back. This sound was like a key that turned everything into reality. The source of this sound was definitely a sign that something was in the house. In that moment, fear and curiosity mixed inside her. Everything was approaching her like a nightmare. Slowly, she turned and decided to leave the living room. She thought of getting through the night just by waiting for morning. But when the door opened and she heard that terrifying sound, she thought morning would never come. She felt like she was being dragged by her fear, but she had to do something. She immediately turned on the light, creating a bright atmosphere in the room. However, she had to spend the night with the lights on. The darkness only heightened her fear inside. Throughout the night, until the first light of morning, nothing happened again. But every moment, she felt something shifting. That dark sound echoed in her mind. When morning came, she told herself that nothing had been real, that it was just the result of exhaustion. But something inside her whispered that there was something in every corner of the house, a shadow she couldn't detect. As evening came again, Eliza decided to view the events as normal. These were just temporary things. The house was old, the walls creaked. Maybe it was just a hallucination. But as she prepared to spend another night, she felt that something was trying to force her to accept it. When Eliza returned home after work, tired from the day, her mind drew her into the silence, seeking some peace. When she entered the house, everything was the same. The wooden floors, the old walls, the slight breeze by the window. Everything was as it should be. But tonight, Everything felt different. Slowly placing her bag on the table, the unease returned, like the shadows of the past 2 nights. Everything should have returned to normal, right? But in the mornings, it was easy to think everything was fine. At night, something changed. She slowly went to the kitchen and prepared something. As she ate dinner, her eyes began to grow heavy. She was so tired that she hoped to get through the night quietly. But the thoughts in her mind couldn't be quieted. However, the thoughts in her mind couldn't be silenced. The whispers she heard that morning, the door to the living room opening once again. All of this made her feel like the nightmares would never end. But maybe she was just overthinking and was afraid for no reason. Taking a few deep breaths, she tried to recall the morning in the quiet of the evening. Somehow she couldn't accept that there was a hidden danger inside the house. After going through her evening routine, Eliza went to her bedroom. She leaned against the headboard and closed her eyes for a moment. The tension and anxiety of the day had forced her into a deep sleep. But with each passing minute, her unease grew. An inner fear was making her realize that something was changing. An inner warning was telling her that something would happen before she fell asleep. After all, when the living room door opened again that morning, she had missed something. It was around midnight. Eliza opened her eyes in the middle of her sleep. Slowly, quietly, she turned, and her unease increased. In that moment, she heard the door creak open slightly. Was it the wind or... That night, for the first time, something was different. There was no sound. It was so quiet that the only noise in the house came from her own heartbeat. Slowly getting up, she started moving toward the door, fear urging her to close it. At that moment, she felt that everything was about to change. As she moved toward the living room, that strange feeling was stronger than ever. Eliza felt like every movement, every sound in the dark rooms was watching her like a threat. The house, just like the previous nights, was dark. She approached the living room door with slow steps. However, her eyes never left the shadows in the corners of the room. The feeling inside her that something was about to emerge deepened with every moment. The door was slightly open, but this time her fear had grown. Slowly, as her feet silently moved on the floor, she took a deep breath. In that moment, she saw movement in the darkness behind the living room. A silhouette was beginning to appear. At first it looked like just a shadow, but it became clearer. Eliza felt her heart begin to race. 1,000 thoughts and unresolved questions spun in her head. She was so scared that with every step she thought about retreating, but something was forcing her to keep moving forward. Was that silhouette really there? She continued moving slowly, but her eyes couldn't tear away from the silhouette. The shadow was moving in the darkness, but who was it? What was it doing? Eliza's body froze suddenly. She had only taken a few steps back, but with that movement, the silhouette also took a step closer. She held her breath quickly. Her eyes were still fixed on the silhouette, trying not to focus on its details. She wanted to believe everything was just a hallucination, that the darkness was tricking her eyes. But the movements of the silhouette showed that it wasn't a fantasy. That dark, shapeless figure seemed to be watching Eliza's movements. Slowly and silently, the silhouette took another step closer. Eliza felt her heart in her hands. With each beat, every muscle in her body was tensed. She took a deep breath and thought about stepping back, but something was stopping her. Now, escaping seemed impossible. The shape emerging from the darkness was planting fear deep inside her. She held her breath and did nothing for a moment. At that instant, the silhouette took another step and slowly disappeared. Eliza stayed frozen, in place. She was so terrified that it felt like she was sinking into the depths of a river. After all, something was moving toward her. For a moment she thought the silhouette had disappeared, but the fear inside her still lingered. Almost nothing moved, and in the silence of the house everything seemed normal. But that night, something had changed inside Eliza. Something had been lost in the depths of the night, and that dark silhouette was creating a new fear with every step. Eliza's heart was racing in her chest. It was beating so fast that each pulse echoed in every corner of her body. Her eyes were locked on the dark corner of the living room. The silhouette had appeared there for a moment, but something felt wrong. Was this figure just a shadow, or was there really someone there? As thousands of questions tangled in her mind, Eliza's thoughts paused for a brief moment. She wanted to believe it was all just a dream. Maybe exhaustion and stress were fooling her mind. But that dark figure was right in front of her, and with each passing second the fear inside her grew. She took a few steps back, took a deep breath. The darkness had wrapped around the living room like a snake, drunkenly twisting through it. It was so deep that every corner of the house seemed to be approaching her threateningly. As Eliza's mind twisted in fear, her hand slowly reached out toward the light. Her fingertips were cold. She was so terrified that her hands were trembling. With every step she took toward the light, she felt one step closer to safety. But in that moment, the figure took another step. Eliza froze. The figure appeared motionless in the dark, but suddenly, almost imperceptibly, it began to move. Another step in the darkness, then another followed. The figure's slow movements sent chills down Eliza's spine. She could only feel that something was approaching in the darkness. But before her eyes, the silhouette became clearer. Slowly, she began to realize. This wasn't a reflection. It wasn't a shadowy figure in the dark. It was a person. Her eyes were staring deeply, almost as if into an abyss. Fear spread to every part of Eliza's body. Those eyes seemed to come from another world, another dimension, staring at her. She held her breath. The eyes seemed to be lost in emptiness, yet they contained life. The figure's gaze felt like it was seeping into Eliza's soul. Suddenly, she felt that something had changed. She realized that fear had opened a void within her. That void was the same as what grew in the figure's eyes. A deep, dark void. Eliza was frozen, not knowing what to do. Fear had taken control of her body. She couldn't believe the mixture of shock and fear reflected in her eyes was real. That silhouette wasn't the innocent dream she had thought it was. It was really there. It was really watching her. The figure took another step. Eliza, overwhelmed by a wave of fear, stepped back. Everything before her eyes blurred. She slowly took a step back, avoiding the figure's gaze. She didn't want to relive that moment. But as she thought everything was rapidly retreating, her foot moved and her eyes met the figure's. Her mind echoed with a scream. Those eyes, deep and dark. In that moment, it felt like she was falling into those eyes. Eliza felt as though she was being buried in something. The emptiness in those eyes was slowly pulling her in. It was as if everything inside her was about to disappear. With the terror of that moment, she slowly tried to pull back, but the figure moved forward without stopping. Eliza panicked and managed to turn on the light. In that instant, everything suddenly brightened with the light. The figure disappeared. The darkness in the living room had surrendered to the light. But that silhouette, those terrifying eyes, had left a deep mark on her mind. The whole house became silent. But Eliza, even in this moment of normality, still felt uneasy. Scanning every corner of the house, she noticed one thing. The figure had vanished, but the moment she'd locked eyes with it, had left traces of something lost. It was so deep and real that she couldn't understand what had really happened. Even though the figure had disappeared, those dark eyes were still in front of Eliza's eyes. After all, she would spend the night like a nightmare, constantly feeling that something was following her, like a shadow. Because something had changed. That silhouette was no longer just an image. It was a deep warning. Eliza would spend the night, and by the time morning came, she would never again be able to distinguish the difference between reality and illusion. Eliza had been trying to ignore the strange events she had been experiencing in the last few days and the appearance of that terrifying dark figure. Every night she heard the living room door open by itself, and with each time she was drawn deeper into fear. She had gotten so used to it that she thought she should somehow become immune to her fear. But the truth was, each night, her fear grew stronger, and as she tried to face the darkness, that fear began to overwhelm her like intoxication. One evening, after a long day, she returned home hoping that everything would end. She had to pull herself together to face the morning, but she had one thought. That night, she decided not to turn on the lights. Darkness, perhaps, was her only real companion. A night without lights might give her the courage to face her fears. After all, how much could she really care anymore? The real truth was to find the source of the fear. She knew she couldn't stop whatever was moving in the dark, but perhaps the thing she feared was nothing more than her imagination. As she moved deeper into the night, Eliza prepared her bed. She was so tired that she wanted to close her eyes immediately. But there was something. There was a strange unease in the air. In her mind, the dark figure felt like it was waking up every night, coming closer to her. As she stepped into the loneliness of the night, she began to think that everything was becoming even more terrifying. But still, she was determined not to turn on the lights. Maybe spending the night in the dark was the only way to get rid of her fears. As the clock struck midnight, Eliza once again opened her eyes. The darkness was so complete that she couldn't see a thing. The only source of light in the house was a few beams of light slipping through the street lamp outside. Everything around her was silent, but something felt off. A deep stillness seemed to engulf the night. Then, from the living room door, came the familiar creak. Eliza's heart tightened. As always, the door had opened by itself. But tonight, something was different. The sound stopped for a moment. That's when Eliza noticed a movement in the darkness just behind the door. She held her breath, her eyes fixed on the dark. She was so focused that she could hear every movement clearly. Her heart raced. Was the figure, that terrifying dark silhouette, there again? Eliza slowly began to move her body. She could feel something approaching, but no matter what, tonight, she had decided to face the darkness. Quietly, she got out of bed. Her feet barely touched the floor, but she was so careful not to make a sound. Slowly, she reached her hand toward the door. With every second, she could hear the beating of her heart. The depth of the night seemed to wrap around her. The darkness was creating a transformation of fear. She took another step, then paused, for a moment. The movement behind the door continued. A brief rush of cold wind brushed her shoulder. Taking a deep breath, she quickly pushed the door open. As she stepped into the dark void, she moved toward the light switch. But tonight, everything was different. When she closed the door, the figure had taken another step forward. Something watching her, Eliza's courage and fears, slowly began to envelop her. She slammed the door shut. But as she closed her eyes and tried to turn on the light, she noticed something. The figure was much closer now. Right in front of the door, a silhouette had become clearer in the dark. Eliza opened her eyes. There was a deep silence. But this time, the figure's movement was unmistakable. It was so close that Eliza could feel its presence. A deep frozen fear spread through her body. The figure had never been this vivid. Those eyes, glowing in the darkness, were like a void staring back at her. In that moment, Eliza lost herself. Fear seized her body. But for a brief moment, a wave of shock passed through her. She realized then that the figure wasn't just a figment of her imagination. It was truly watching her. Staring deeply into its eyes, Eliza felt the entity focus entirely on her. She took a deep breath, but even though she wanted to ignore it, something was holding her back. When the figure took a step forward, Eliza slowly backed away. But the figure took another step closer. Fully feeling her fear, Eliza made a move. She quickly turned on the light, and the figure vanished. But not just its eyes and silhouette. This entity had left a much longer imprint on Eliza's mind. As she retreated, she still felt a lingering threat. Was this real, or just a dream? That night, the silhouette had disappeared before her eyes, but Eliza no longer doubted it. Someone, or something, was watching her. For the past few days, Eliza had been trying to forget the terrifying events that had occurred in her home. But with each passing day, the memories of the creepy figure and those cold, deep eyes kept returning to her mind. At night, the doors opening by themselves, the figure getting closer each night, and finally locking eyes with her, had invaded her dreams. Every time she closed her eyes, that dark silhouette would reappear, watching her, becoming more and more terrifying. Her fear was growing stronger every day. But there was something. Eliza was determined to find out if this fear was just a coincidence, or if it had a deeper meaning. One morning, as the dark night faded, Eliza gathered her courage and decided to investigate the history of the house. Perhaps there was an explanation for these strange occurrences. There could be something hidden in every corner of the old house. Having spent the whole night sleepless, Eliza decided to visit the local library before starting her research. The library kept a series of old files and records about the history of the town. At the library, she found old newspaper clippings and magazines that chronicled the history of the town. She carefully examined each page, but the most striking find was an article about the house's previous owner. What caught her attention was the information about a man who had once owned the house and his mysterious disappearance. The year he had gone missing matched exactly with the year Eliza moved in. In the mid-1930s, this man had suddenly disappeared without a trace one night. The townspeople had started a large search, but they never found any sign of him. The article mentioned that strange events began to occur in the house shortly after his disappearance. Doors started opening by themselves, objects moved around, but eventually, everything was forgotten, and no one questioned the disappearance any further. Eliza's research left her in sheer terror. The man had vanished, but something made her feel that the lost soul was still present in the house. The doors opening by themselves at night, the silhouette appearing in the dark, the constant sensation of being watched. None of this felt like mere coincidence anymore. Exactly 90 years after the man had disappeared, Eliza was in that house. Now, every corner of the house felt filled with the spirit of the missing man. Frozen in shock, Eliza realized the horrifying truth. The figure she had seen that night was the soul of the man who had disappeared. Perhaps the figure had never truly left. The man's spirit had been trapped in the house after his death, forever watching and waiting. His soul had been bound to this house. The figure behind the doors, the one Eliza first noticed, was a kind of call. The man somehow wanted to be seen, wanted to be recognized. Perhaps that lost soul was simply waiting for someone to notice him and learn about his past. This forgotten, terrifying tale had found its way into Eliza's life. She knew when she returned home that night everything would be different. It was clear now. She could no longer carry that fear within her. Every moment inside that house felt like being followed by the spirit of the lost man. The creaking doors, the sounds around her, only reinforced the truth that it was all coming from him. She spent the night awake, unable to sleep. She couldn't even close her eyes for a moment. The echoes of fear in her mind merged with the shadowy spirit of the lost man. Those dark eyes continued to watch her. Hours without sleep had left Eliza's eyes bloodshot and exhausted. Every creak of the door, every rustle of the wind made her feel the fear closing in. But that night, she had to see the morning. The next morning, the sunlight streamed through her window. But for Eliza, morning was merely the beginning of another nightmare. Throughout the night, the doors had opened and closed one after another, signaling that the presence of the terrifying figure had grown even closer. In that moment, Eliza fully understood the truth. That figure was the spirit of the lost man. His soul, appearing like a shadow, wandering like a ghost, was merely the trapped form of the man who had once disappeared. Now Eliza was too afraid to stay in that house any longer. The terror she had experienced all night long had completely consumed her. The eyes of the lost man still lingered in hers. She couldn't gather the courage to spend another night there. Taking a deep breath, she left the house behind, stepping into the safety of the outside world. She couldn't bear the thought of returning. Every night those dark eyes were still watching her, and Eliza knew she had to escape the curse of that house. It was a place where the spirit of the lost man was trapped, and Eliza didn't want to pay the price of staying there any longer.